My name is Kelly Harvey. My pronouns are she and they. I am the museum specialist for the Lower Colorado region for the Bureau of Reclamation. And this presentation is titled Agents of Deterioration and Southern Nevada. So what am I talking about when I say Lower Colorado region? Right now you're looking at a map of this region. It extends from Southern California into Southern Nevada, most of Arizona, a tiny bit of Utah, and the traditional area does extend into New Mexico. So this presentation is going to kind of be stylized in an interpretive or evening program format. I was a park ranger for 10 years, and on the screen you can see two different pictures of me giving that kind of evening program. So this program's going to be roughly 40-ish minutes. If you have any questions, please pop those into the chat and we can get to those later on in the presentation. I'm going to be asking a ton of questions and I would love to see everybody's comments and questions along the way. So please do pop those into the chat. We're going to start by talking about our different lenses, both lenses that are personal as well as lenses that are professional. A lot of this presentation is going to be on the agents of deterioration or specific lens from a museum standpoint. And then I'd like to get to the question at the end, are these different lenses helpful or can they be unhelpful or potentially improper? And I would like to dedicate this presentation to two men in my life. The first man would be my dad, who's currently in the ICU, to a father who always listened to a bunch of questions and answered them for his curious kiddo, and to all the people on their healthcare journey. May they be safe and their caregivers as well. The second person I'd like to dedicate this to is my husband, whose support makes everything possible, especially this past week. So these different lenses. To talk about these various lenses, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I got here in the Lower Colorado region. I first started my federal journey working for a historic site for the Forest Service, one of very few, called Gray Towers National Historic Site in Pennsylvania. This is in the ancestral lands of the Lenape, or the people of the River Valley, the Delaware people, and the Susquehannock people. Now, my office was in the second story there. This is where Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt would come up with the idea of use versus preservation for our public lands. This was Gifford Pinchot's family's castle. You can still go there today. My favorite historical photo from here is in that second story window, Theodore Roosevelt holding Gifford Pinchot out of that window by his ankles. From there, I worked at a site called Agate Fossil Beds National Monument in western Nebraska. This is where a bunch of learned individuals in the early 20th century took a bunch of dynamite out to those hills and basically blasted it in order to find these incredible Miocene paleontological pieces. In doing that, they created a bunch of very small microscopic fossils that cannot be used for any scientific study. So Agate Fossil Beds is an amazing place for you to go if you're able to make that trek out to those hills and see those incredible fossil finds. Especially for youngsters, it's a once in a lifetime kind of thing. Now, of course, this means do not take anything from our national park sites or any federal lands. That's against the law. And we also practice leave no trace practices, which includes leaving everything behind. But this is an amazing place to go and see different kinds of Miocene fossils. From there, I worked at Badlands National Park. Both Badlands and Agate Fossil Beds are the ancestral lands of the Lakota, Cheyenne, Dakota, Ogallala Sioux, and many others. Now, recently at this site, they discovered an extinct form of deer, the tiny hornless deer called the Santucci Merix. It was about the size of a house cat, but this was discovered because a person found this in Badlands, came to the visitor center and reported it. So citizen science, or very much what many of you do as site stewards, reporting things back to other individuals, constantly contributes to science even today. From Badlands, I worked at a battlefield called Big Hole Battlefield. This is located in southern Montana. It's a part of the Nez Perce National Historical Park, and this documents many different aspects of Nez Perce culture, as well as the bloody and terrible Nez Perce War. Now, this individual to your left on the screen at the battlefield that I worked at was not yet a chief, but by the end of this bloody battle, his speech would be immortalized into a poem. You can see that at the bottom of the screen. But at the end of the Nez Perce War, this is where Chief Joseph says, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." This is the ancestral lands of course, the Nez Perce, as well as the Dakota, Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Blackfeet, Salish, Crow, and many others. This was a heavily used area. From there, I moved to Mount Rainier National Park. You can see on that picture on the right, it's just this ranger and the mountain. Mount Rainier National Park is the ancestral lands of the Cowlitz, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, Puyallup, Saxon Island, Yakima, and coastal Salish people. Now, recently, and when I say recently, I mean earlier this week, Mount Rainier National Park published this publication you see on your screen, Plants, Tribal Traditions, and the Mountain Practices and Effects of Nisqually Tribal Plant Gatherings at Mount Rainier National Park. My colleagues spent over 25 years putting this together, so if you're interested in learning more about that's a really great publication to start with. From there, I worked at a big hole in the ground here in the West. You may have heard of it, Grand Canyon National Park. This would be the ancestral lands of the Nimwuvi or Southern Paiute, Havasupai, Wallenpai, Shamuubi, Western Shoshone, Dene or Navajo, and many others. From there, I worked at another big hole in this area called Zion National Park, the ancestral lands of the Nimwuvi or Southern Paiute, and many others. From there, I worked at a site in New York City. This was the ancestral lands of the Lenape, and this is called Stonewall National Monument. This was a site that commemorates the events that started on June 28th, 1969, happened for a series of days, and ended up being the catalyst for the modern LGBTQ plus movement. Today, this land is a gathering place for many to celebrate. Like what you see in that picture on the right is a naturalization ceremony, or all those people are swearing allegiance to the United States. This is a site where people gather to mourn. This is a site where people gather to celebrate, to do a wide variety of things. And this past month opened up to its very first visitor center to the public. From that, I moved here to the lower Colorado region. So as you're looking at this map, there are offices in this region in Boulder City, which is where I primarily work. There are other offices in Phoenix, Yuma, and Temecula as well. So this area kind of oversees a lot of the Colorado River. This is the ancestral lands of many tribes that are previously mentioned, as well as the Yavapai, Apache, Moanave, and many others. Highly recommend, if you are traveling across the United States or Canada, to check out the site or app nativeland.ca. It's a fantastic app to use to see the other peoples and cultures, as well as languages that existed in these areas and still exist today. So that brings me to what I do here. So I am a museum specialist. It's kind of a mix of a bunch of different things. You may have heard of some of these terms before, like curator, archivist, exhibit preparator. I would say a lot of what I do falls in to the collections manager kind of category. A collection manager is kind of the between the artifacts and the public themselves. So that means it's a lot of paperwork, but it's also assisting interns. It's assisting these objects on their journey from storage to display and preservation. So looking at these photos from left to right, on the left-hand photo, you see my colleague and I, we are in the Hoover Dam collections. The Hoover Dam collections protects the artifacts from Hoover Dam, Parker Dam, and Davis Dam as well. In the center photo, you see a lot of what my job is, which is paperwork and documentation. And then over there on the right-hand side, you see we do have some exhibit areas. In this region right now, these exhibit areas are for employees only, but these are all the kind of positions that I do as a museum specialist. What kind of artifacts are in the regional office? Well, it's really two types of artifacts, excuse me, come from two different sources for the Bureau of Reclamation. Really quickly going over that Bureau of Reclamation symbol. Right now you see that symbol, that's more of the traditional, what you may think of that blue oval with those mountain peaks inside. Currently the symbol for the Bureau of Reclamation is that dam picture that's on there. So going back to those two different types of collections, a lot of the collections in the regional office as well as other federal locations would be from ARPA, or the Archaeological Resource Protection Act. Specifically in this region of the world, if you're looking for a little bit more explanation or to dive a little bit more into ARPA for this area, I would recommend looking into the area of Blanding, Utah, especially in the 2009 era. And then for NHPA, or the National Historic Preservation Act, a lot of the artifacts are to prove its historic nature. I think a lot of times when we think of NHPA, we think of that placard that's on a building, but there's so many things that can fall under this particular act. It can be a building, it can be a district, it can be an object, site, structure, it can be so many different things that can classify under NHPA. And this particular act turned 50 in 2016. So what kind of lenses did I develop over time? Well, some of these lenses I developed during my time as a park ranger. So you see on that photo on the left, I think a lot of visitors have told me when they see something like this, some words that come to mind are wild or wilderness, some kind of majestic nature. To me, when you see a wild animal in a national park, that center picture is a little bit more what that's like. Maybe seeing an elk too close to a parking lot, or having people a little bit too close to that wild animal. But over time, the lens I started to develop being a park ranger was the incidences of involving wild animals, seeing people maybe do things they shouldn't be doing, or people doing everything that they should be and just accidentally interacting with wild animals, and the hurt that can happen. Over time, as I was a park ranger, I realized this was a lens that I was developing, that I was struggling with seeing the lens that the visitor was coming into. So these were two different lenses that I was uncovering over time that I needed to reckon with professionally and personally. Another lens that I began to develop over time had to do with some extreme trails. In our national parks, we have some amazing places and some amazing ways to get there. Sometimes visitors have told me, looking at these majestic trails, they think once in a lifetime. They think a level of strength or a level of opportunity to prove themselves to these different ways. But to me, over time, I've seen many of these more extreme trails overcrowded, or I've seen visitors treat these trails in a way that maybe isn't best, either doing things on or off trail that maybe isn't the best, or just having run-of-the-mill medical events out in the middle of nowhere and trying to provide medical services to these people over time. So this was a lens that I realized over my time being a park ranger that I was beginning to develop that was a little bit different from the constituents that I was trying to serve. Now, there are definitely some other lenses out there to be thinking about. One of the lenses I seem to notice is when historical events happen, and maybe us or the people next to us whip out their cameras and they don't just take a picture, they video the entire historical event. Is that right? Is that what we should be doing? I'm not sure. I absolutely don't have the answer for that, but all of us here watching this presentation have lived through multiple historical events, and I'm sure all of us have seen that human nature of whipping out our phones and seeing this historical event through the lens of our phones and not the lens of necessarily our eyes. Another lens that I see quite frequently, I'm not sure if you've ever been to an amazing piece of architecture, but there's maybe that one friend that you have that says, I wonder what the insurance is on something like this. That's absolutely something I thought about every time I went to the Metropolitan Opera in New York. I thought about, oh my gosh, how do you insure something like this? That's a lens that people may bring into that situation. When I've done this presentation before to a group in a public library in Henderson, a person told me that their lens was nature. When they were out in nature, they had a hard time seeing human-made objects. Their eyes tended to just kind of glance over those human-made objects and really focus on that nature. Of course, this can be pleasant. This can be nice. This can help fuel our interactions with nature and those things. But when it comes for site stewards and us to document the various things we see, it's important to make sure that we're looking at it through the proper lens that we should be doing. So now that we've talked about a couple different lenses in the past, I'd like to tell you a little bit about a museum lens. Here is one of my husband's favorite photos of me in a museum. This would be in the Henry Ford Museum at a Jim Henderson Muppets exhibit. So how did museums develop? How did this lens of how we look at museum artifacts, collections, displays develop over time? Well, the very first documented museum was in the state of or modern day Iraq. It was documented in 530 BC, and it's the Ingoldi Nana Museum. It was curated by the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is the first documented museum that history knows of. Now, it's the museum in the foreground, not the museum in the background that you see in this particular picture. Over time, the ancient Greek and ancient Roman, empires did have various museums, zoos, and libraries. But around the time of the medieval time in Europe, you began to find these cabinets of curiosities. These were privately owned collections that rich individuals collected and could do or say whatever they wanted. The the depiction on the left is the very first depiction of a cabinet of curiosity that history has. It's a depiction from 1599 from the Dell Historia Naturale. And as you can see here, kind of on the ceiling, there's many different sea or water-dwelling creatures kind of tacked up to the ceiling. Against the side, there are mounted bird specimens, and then just many specimens in books scattered throughout. The picture on the right-hand side, if you want to take a look at that, it's a hodgepodge. It's a collection of paintings, of artifacts, of things put together. It was very common for these cabinets of curiosities to, of course, not be standardized, to have these individuals sew or adhere different pieces together and make up and say whatever they wanted to. Now, over time, these cabinets of curiosities began to become public museums. And one of the first examples of this would be the Ashmolean Museum that still exists today. The Ashmolean Museum started as a cabinet of curiosities from 1634 to 1682. In 1682, the collection was given to this building structure and was made quote unquote public. Of course, it costs a few dollars to get in. So not everybody could go in and see these artifacts, but over time, these cabinets of curiosities began to be standardized. What was said about them, how they were treated over time. And that kind of brings us to modern day museums. Now, things have been displayed in many different environments across the world since 530 BC, but a holistic view of the different factors that affect them didn't come about until 1992. The Canadian Institute of Museums put together this list, and they called it the Agents of Deterioration. It is a group of 10 different themes of forces that affect museums, and that's what I want to talk about here next. These 10 different themes of these different forces that affect museums. This is the lens that I have on every minute when I am working in a museum field. When I go into a repository, when I go into an exhibit, this is the framework that I think of. Again, it was first published in 1993 and then later put together and further published in 1994. So that's what I want to talk about here next, are these different agents of deterioration. If you right now can think of a different agent that I have yet to discuss, please pop that in the chat. I would love to see what you think affects museum artifacts. But we are going to first quickly go over these different agents and then kind of break them down individually. So first on the screen, we have theft. Theft is something that was known for museums dating all the way back to the ancient Greek times. This was a force that people regularly knew, and museums, especially early museums, would staff security individuals in their front areas. Now, coarse dust and fine particles would be a part of the many pollutants that affect a museum. Fire, of course, affects a museum artifacts. Wear and tear just over time can affect any kind of museum artifact, and temperature as well. But these are only a few of the many different kinds of factors, so let's get into those other factors. So in terms of pollutants, we're going to quickly go over them. So we have nitrogen dioxide, ozone, hydrogen sulfide, hydroxide, and sulfur dioxide. These are a few of the many pollutants that can affect museum artifacts over time. Some more agents of deterioration, stick with me, we're almost through, would be the destruction, theft, vandalism. Peaks. So when we talk about light, when we talk about temperature, when we talk about relative humidity, the peaks in these are almost more harmful than those individual factors themselves. Light can, of course, be an agent of deterioration. I'm sure all of us have walked into a store, and the things that are displayed a little bit closer to the front door are a little bit faded, a little bit more deteriorated than others. Precipitation, of course, can affect a museum piece, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then fluctuation. So peaks and fluctuations are some of the things that I look out the most when I look at graphs studying relative humidity, light, temperature, and things like that. All right. Couple last agents of deterioration. I already mentioned it a bunch of times. Relative humidity. Pests, of course, I'm sure many of you have been screaming at the computer. Pests can affect museum artifacts. Yes, exactly. Pests can affect earthquakes, other massive uh, global kinds of effects can, of course, affect a museum collection. A flood is another one of those. And congratulations, all. We went through the different kinds of agents of deterioration. Good job, everybody. So, just kind of breaking this down again, those 10 different themes of what can affect a museum collection are physical forces, thieves or vandals, fire, water, pests, pollutants, light, including ultraviolet and infrared, incorrect temperature, incorrect relative humidity, and disassociation. So when these agents of deterioration were first published in 1993, there were 9 of them. The disassociation was not included until later. So disassociation is just things that can happen to artifacts over time. They could potentially be absent-minded, putting something down, not writing it down, and then kind of forgetting about it for years. This is absolutely something that could affect a museum artifact, because then the staff doesn't know where it came from. Is it supposed to be here? And a slew of other things. Just general wear and tear because of gravity and these artifacts being on Earth. Also, in terms of gravity, just accidentally dropping things over time, or things affecting an artifact and the general wear and tear that accumulates over time. So these are the 10 different themes of the agents of deterioration. Now, how does this necessarily affect the southern Nevada area? Well, some of the major pests in the southern Nevada area for the collections that I work for would be ringtail. Ringtail are absolutely an issue, especially in areas like our dams. They do exist. They are a member of they're similar to a raccoon, and they can get into these areas and live for a certain amount of time. Now, while they won't potentially damage an artifact, their residue or the things they leave behind absolutely can. Here in Southern Nevada, I'm sure all of us know that crickets are a major issue. In Southern Nevada, specifically the Mormon cricket. This is something that can be found in all different museum collection spaces. And not only are they omnivores and they can eat a variety of things, they can also be an attractant for other pests as well. So not only are they an issue, but the things that they leave behind, like their body parts, can be food for other pests. In Southern Nevada, we have many different kinds of ants, over 16 different varieties of ants, and those can affect especially our organic kinds of collections. And then moths, especially gypsy moths, can affect the different collections here in Southern Nevada, especially when it comes to textiles and things like that. Going back to those pollutants, let's kind of break those down a little bit and see how these different pollutants can affect a museum artifact. In terms of nitrogen dioxide, so this can accidentally be brought into museum spaces, and then over time, given a certain level of temperature and relative humidity, it can form nitric acid. This can attack dyes, cottons, papers, and any kinds of polyester. So part of the reason that these museum collections need to be in safe, sterile locations is to watch and monitor so that even if nitrogen dioxide is introduced into a collection space, that it doesn't form nitric acid. So watching that temperature and relative humidity is extremely important. Ozone. Ozone is something that occurs in any combustible area. It occurs from any kind of gas, any kind of electricity production. It occurs from our printers. It occurs from our computers. I'm sure you've seen many collection spaces that have electronics in it. but given a certain temperature and relative humidity, that ozone can severely affect any kind of art. And it also contributes to the acidification of paper as well. Now, hydrogen sulfide really affects anything organic or biotic. This can come from any kind of decaying matter, so it's kind of present everywhere. So making sure those collection spaces are sterile and clean is incredibly important. Hydroxide, this is something that is treated on a variety of things, on paper, it's treated on textiles, and it can severely affect um, different kinds of organic things you may have in your collection spaces as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be artifacts. It could also be the papers that talk about the artifacts as well. The last kind of pollutant on this particular screen would be sulfur dioxide. So this comes from the burning of any kind of fossil fuels, and it eats everything. It eats chalk. It eats limestone. It eats anything botanical. If you've ever picked up a piece of leather and either find red residue on your hands or find red pieces that come off, that is called red rot. That comes from sulfur dioxide, and it can also embrittle rubber as well. So these various pollutants can have major impacts on a museum collection, and they're not necessarily visible. Some other kinds of pollutants can, of course, going back to those coarse dust or fine particles. These, of course, can get stuck, especially in artwork, like you can see on the right-hand side, and then over time lead to cracks and crevices. In these cracks and crevices, other things can accumulate over time, like silica and calcium. It can, of course, lead to the degradation of art and different kinds of paint-based things. But it can also affect metals. It can affect glass. There's a variety of things that these particular pollutants can affect. And here in southern Nevada, especially during monsoon season, with those winds blowing through, it's incredibly important to be monitoring these particles over time. And these particles can also contribute to something that's called bronze disease, something that can affect the various bronzes that exist out there and completely turn them a different color. I'm sure you've seen a Capitol with various bronze statues around, and those bronze statues over time changing colors. So all of these different pollutants absolutely affect a museum collection. Taking a look at how light can affect a museum collection. Now, light is many varieties of things here in the museum world. We measure it in terms of lux, Lux. So light is a band of radiation to which our eyes are sensitive. So ultraviolet radiation and infrared radiation are not visible. These are not necessarily things that are easy to study. Most of what we study in the museum world would be light coming from either outside or light that we can see, visible light. Light that is acceptable is typically less than 50 lux. If you want to go ahead and take a look at this graph, this is a museum repository that is housed inside. There are no outside lights. No outside, any light from any outside sources. And yet, that 50 lux exceeds almost every time that the light is turned on. That's partially the reason why covering our museum artifacts are incredibly important, either storing them in a cabinet or putting some kind of protective covering over them to reduce the effects of light over time. Speaking of graphs, let's take a look at another graph. So this particular graph has both temperature and relative humidity on it. I'm sure you've been yelling at the computer screen saying, why do you measure relative humidity and not absolute humidity? So absolute humidity would be the amount of water vapor that's in the air, and it's measured in the form of grams. Relative humidity would be the amount of water vapor in the air relative to the maximum amount that can be in a given temperature. and it's measured in the form of percentages. So measuring the absolute humidity would not necessarily be correct. It's kind of like standing in 100 degrees in southern Nevada versus standing in 100 degrees in the Midwest. The humidity outside absolutely affects how you feel. 100 degrees in the desert is like a traditional sunny day. 100 degrees in the Midwest with humidity above 90% feels like you're standing in soup. So we want to measure in the museum world relative humidity and not absolute humidity. So taking a look at this graph, you can see that in some of our indoor places, it is possible to balance out the temperature over time. And of course, with our hotter temperatures in the summer, that temperature rises and rises. But take a look at that relative humidity. Some things that you may see on this graph are those fluctuations, those peaks. Those are not so good. Think about wood that is being held in place by metal nails. The relative humidity may make that wood swell, grow bigger and smaller given a certain temperature and water vapor in the air. But those metal nails, they're not swelling to that same degree. That amount of pressure that these changes, the fluctuations and peaks, put on various things affected by relative humidity absolutely affects our museum artifacts over time. One thing that can be an indicator would be mold. Mold can come about from incorrect temperature and relative humidity, as well as introducing artifacts into an area that isn't right. But mold can present in a many different kinds of ways. A common form of mold that is not exactly mold is called foxing, like you see in that picture to the right. It's not active mold, it's just an acidification of the paper over time, going back to those agents that may have treated the paper, that hydroxide and other kinds of agents like that. So be very cautious if you see something that may look moldy. Mold can present in a variety of ways, especially in this desert environment. Now, there's also natural and human-caused disasters. Here in southern Nevada, some of the majors would be flood damage. Recently, that would be in the Nevada Railroad Museum. Especially during our monsoonal rains, floods can happen. Chemical damage has occurred in the Southern Nevada museums. And then, of course, especially illuminated in the other videos in the series, graffiti can affect a variety of things. And theft has occurred in museums throughout all of time. Now, why is it important to take a look at these lenses? Well, one of the reasons is to make sure that we're looking at it correctly, that we don't necessarily have a bias, that we're looking at everything we're supposed to. Now, biases can come in the form of explicit biases, like those lenses that I've been talking about. These lenses that I'm fully aware that I am looking at a museum collection through. So sometimes these lenses can absolutely help us, can assist us. Sometimes these lenses can hurt us over time, but often we can know about these lenses. Another kind of bias that can absolutely affect the ways that we see things can be implicit bias or an unconscious bias. Now, several scientific studies have shown that it is possible that biases have helped the human species over time, have helped us see things that we humans should steer clear of, like plants, natural disasters, how to protect against those various things. And many times these biases could be logical. There could be an absolute reason why we develop these lenses, these biases over time. But are they correct? Are they equal? Is it something that we should necessarily have? So something important to keep in mind as you site stewards are going out, as we're looking at a museum collections, is are we really looking at everything, or do we have the potential glasses of a bias on? Do we have that when we're monitoring a site? Do we have that when we're reporting later or elsewhere in our lives? Do we necessarily have a particular type of lens that maybe would be appropriate to be a little more conscious of, to think, is it correct for this situation, or should we steer clear of this particular lens? But how do we keep our museum collection safe looking at all of these varieties of issues? Well, one thing we can do is make sure that we print on lignin-free paper. It is a particular type of substance that occurs in trees that does lead to the degradation of paper over time. So lignin-free paper is absolute when it comes to anything that should be kept for a long time. No adhesives ever. No tape, no glue, no anything like that. They're absolutely museum quality adhesives. And if you have any questions about that, please ask me after this presentation or email me. But along with those no adhesives, there's no reason to use things like paper clips or staples. In a museum training throughout my undergrad and graduate school and my first internships, I have removed hundreds of thousands of deteriorated paper clips and staples. So please, if you're going to use a paper clip or a staple, use a plastic one. Monitor your collections. Be aware of the light, relative humidity, and temperature, and be aware of those peaks and fluctuations and how they can happen over time. But most importantly of all, be aware of those lenses. Be aware of how you're looking at a particular event, and be aware and practice of how to take off those lenses and put them back on when necessary. So thank you all for joining this presentation here today. I've got a couple of sources up here. Of course, the Canadian Institute of Museums, who coined those agents of deterioration, but a few other sources as well. And I hope you all listening here today have a great and safe and wonderful day.